the police car crawled up the street, its tires whispering on the asphalt, and came to a slow, deliberate stop. The flashing blue and red lights painted the quiet suburban street in an eerie, pulsating glow. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I turned, my gaze fixed on the officer emerging from the vehicle. His eyes, weary and knowing, shifted between me and the furious woman standing like a gargoyle on my perfectly manicured lawn. Brenda, her name dripped with venom, arms crossed so tightly her knuckles were white, nostrils flaring like a dragon about to unleash fire. She stood there, a caricature of a villain who had just masterminded some nefarious plot. Finally, her voice, sharp and shrill, sliced through the evening air. "I've had enough of these hooligans disturbing the peace," she shrieked, marching with the rigid purpose of a soldier up to the officer before I could even utter a single word. "You need to do something." The officer, an older man named Officer Miller, with lines etched around his tired eyes like a road map of countless neighborhood disputes, let out a long, weary sigh. He pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket. "And by hooligans, ma'am," he asked, his voice calm despite the palpable tension, "you mean the children playing in their own yard?" "Yes." Brenda spat, her perfectly manicured finger, adorned with a glinting, oversized ring, jabbing aggressively toward my kids. They were now huddled together near the swing set, their small faces pale with confusion, eyes wide like startled deer caught in headlights. "They're so obnoxious. And I have been telling this man," she punctuated her words with another accusatory jab in my direction, "to control his brats, but he refuses. This is a clear violation of noise regulations." I took a deep breath, fighting back the urge to burst out laughing at the sheer ridiculousness of the situation. "Officer," I began, my voice steady, "all they were doing was playing tic-tac-toe." "Tic-tac-toe?" Brenda gasped, clutching her chest dramatically as if I had just confessed to a capital offense. "Playing tic-tac-toe at this hour?" It's nearly. She flicked her wrist, her expression faltering for the briefest of seconds as she checked her expensive watch. 6:15 p.m. Officer Miller gave her a long, unimpressed look that could curdle milk. "Ma'am, that's not exactly a noise violation." Brenda's face twitched, a muscle spasming near her tightly drawn lips. "It's disturbing. I work hard. I deserve peace and quiet in my own neighborhood." Before I could even formulate a response, my youngest daughter, Lily, who had been clutching her beloved stuffed unicorn, Sparkly Hoof, tilted her head, her innocent voice carrying clearly through the quiet air. "Daddy," she whispered loudly, her brow furrowed in confusion, "is that the mean lady who said we should play inside forever?" Officer Miller's lips twitched, and I could see the barest hint of a smirk playing on his face. I, however, had no such restraint. A genuine smile spread across my face. "Yes, sweetheart," I said gently, "that's her." Brenda let out an exaggerated gasp, her hand flying to her chest again. "This is harassment. Are you hearing this?" Officer Miller exhaled, the sound carrying a clear message of a man reaching the absolute limit of his patience. "Ma'am, do you have any evidence that these children are violating any laws?" Brenda squared her shoulders, puffing out her chest like a puffed-up robin. "I don't need evidence. I know the law. Children shouldn't be allowed to scream like wild animals whenever they please." "Ah," Officer Miller murmured, jotting something down in his notepad. Brenda's smug expression returned, a triumphant glint in her eyes. But then, the officer looked up and said something that wiped that smugness right off her face. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your ID for the first time since this utterly ridiculous situation began." Brenda hesitated. "What? Why?" "Because," Officer Miller stated calmly, his gaze unwavering, "you just admitted to knowingly making a false police report." Brenda blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a malfunctioning robot. "I know. They were disturbing the peace." At 6:15 p.m. Officer Miller tilted his head, his expression one of weary disbelief. "Ma'am, do you hear yourself right now?" Brenda's arms flailed, her composure finally cracking. "There are laws. I will not be disrespected like this." Officer Miller flipped his notepad shut with a decisive snap. "Ma'am, do you know what the penalty is for misusing emergency services?" Brenda's face flushed a lovely shade of crimson. "Penalty?" "Yes?" Officer Miller continued, his voice firm. "Wasting police resources for personal grievances can result in a fine. And from what I'm hearing, this wasn't your first complaint about these kids, was it?" Brenda's eyes darted nervously toward me. I raised an eyebrow, a small, satisfied smile playing on my lips, enjoying every single second of this glorious unraveling. "Oh, no, officer," I interjected, my voice dripping with mock concern, "she's been at this for months." Officer Miller nodded slowly. "Then I'll need to file a report." Brenda's entire demeanor shifted. The smugness vanished, replaced by a dawning look of sheer panic. "Wait! Wait! You're fining me? That's not how this works." "Actually, ma'am," Officer Miller said, pulling out a ticket book from his back pocket, "that is how this works." My kids, sensing the dramatic shift in power, began whispering excitedly to each other, their earlier fear replaced with a sense of childish glee. Even Lily, usually shy around strangers, giggled and hugged Sparkly Hoof a little tighter. Brenda stomped her foot with all the petulance of a spoiled child. "I called you to do something about them." "And I did," Officer Miller said, calmly writing down her name and address. "I found that no crime was committed except for yours." The pure, undiluted rage that exploded from Brenda in that moment could have powered a small city. She sputtered, her hands flapping like a broken windmill, her face contorted into an expression of disbelief so dramatic it could have won an Oscar. "This is insane. This is abuse of power." Officer Miller finished tearing the ticket from the book and handed it to her. $500 fine, he stated matter-of-factly. Brenda snatched the ticket as if it were coated in poison. "You're going to regret this," she hissed, her eyes narrowing into venomous slits as she glared at me. I smiled, tucking my hands casually into my pockets. "Oh, I sincerely doubt that." She turned on her heel and stomped back toward her house, her every step radiating fury. But not before, in a petty final act of defiance, she deliberately stomped on a few of my kids' sidewalk chalk drawings, grinding the colorful creations into dust. Officer Miller exhaled, shaking his head slightly as he glanced at me. "Some people, huh?" I chuckled, a genuine laugh bubbling up from my chest. "You have no idea." As he walked back to his patrol car, my son, Mikey, whispered, his eyes wide with hope, "Dad, does this mean we can play louder now?" I grinned, ruffling his hair. "Maybe just a little." The patrol car pulled away, its flashing lights receding into the twilight, and just like that, the most ridiculous, satisfying showdown I had ever experienced was over. Or so I thought. Because Brenda? Oh, she wasn't done. Not even close. Brenda didn't take the fine well. In fact, I had never seen a human being look so personally offended by a mere piece of paper in my entire life. She stood on her porch, gripping the ticket as if she could crush it into oblivion through sheer, unadulterated rage alone. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt a sliver of pity for her. Almost. But then she locked eyes with me, her gaze filled with such unfiltered spite that it sent a crystal-clear message: I wasn't just dealing with an angry neighbor anymore. I had just declared war. The next morning, I expected things to calm down. After all, she had already thoroughly embarrassed herself, gotten slapped with a hefty fine, and made a complete fool of her ridiculous argument. But Brenda wasn't the type to admit defeat. No, she was the type to double down, to escalate, and that became terrifyingly apparent the moment I stepped outside to grab my morning newspaper. She was already there, standing stiffly on her front lawn, arms crossed so tightly they looked like they might snap. The way she was staring at me made it feel like I had personally ruined her entire existence. "Morning, Brenda," I said, trying to sound as normal and unconcerned as possible. She let out a loud, dramatic huff that sounded like air escaping a punctured tire. "Don't think this is over." I sighed, the weight of this ridiculous feud settling heavily on my shoulders. Brenda, it was a fine. Just pay it and move on. Oh, I will, she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm, but I'll also be making sure this neighborhood isn't turned into a circus by your wild, uncontrollable children. I had to bite my tongue to stop myself from laughing. Seriously, Brenda? You're still going on about this? She took a step forward, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, her eyes gleaming with a manic intensity. You have no idea who you're messing with. And with that ominous threat hanging in the air, she spun on her heel and marched back inside her house, the door slamming shut with a resounding thwack. I watched her go, shaking my head in disbelief. It was almost impressive, in a terrifying sort of way. Most people would have given up by now, cut their losses, and retreated. But Brenda had somehow convinced herself that she was on a righteous mission, a lone warrior battling the forces of suburban chaos. Unfortunately for her, my kids weren't about to stop playing outside just because she had a personal vendetta against fun. That afternoon, I sat on my porch, enjoying the warm sunshine and the sounds of my kids running around in the yard, their laughter echoing through the air as they chased each other. Everything felt peaceful, almost normal. That is, until I heard the unmistakable sound of Brenda's front door slamming open. I turned my head just in time to see her storming across her lawn toward me, a folded piece of paper clutched tightly in her fist. "Ha!" she boomed, waving the paper triumphantly in my face. "Thought you were so smart, didn't you?" I blinked, utterly bewildered. "What?" Brenda shoved the paper aggressively towards me, her eyes practically sparkling with malicious glee. "The HOA sent you a warning." I took the paper, unfolding it carefully, my confusion slowly giving way to a sense of weary resignation. Sure enough, it was an official notice from the Homeowners Association, stating that I had received a complaint about excessive noise after reasonable hours. I looked back up at Brenda, who was practically vibrating with excitement, her arms crossed, a wide, self-satisfied grin plastered across her face like she had just won the lottery. "It's not a joke," she declared. "You broke the rules. Now you have to suffer the consequences." I read the complaint again, then checked the timestamp. My eyes narrowed. "Brenda," I said slowly, my voice dangerously low, "this says the violation happened at 10 p.m. last night." "Exactly," she snapped, her voice sharp and triumphant. "See? The HOA agrees with me." I scoffed, a humorless sound. "Brenda, my family was out of town last night." The triumphant color drained from her face so fast I thought she might actually faint. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I could practically hear the gears in her head screeching to a halt as she desperately tried to process this unexpected information. "That's not possible," she finally managed, her voice a mere whisper. "Oh, it is," I said, pulling out my phone, a wicked smile spreading across my face. "Want to see the security footage?" She recoiled as if I had offered her a venomous snake. That's not necessary." I ignored her frantic protests, tapping on my security app. A few moments later, a clear video played on the screen, our empty driveway, the stillness of the house, and the timestamp proving unequivocally that we hadn't even been home. I turned the phone toward her, watching as her jaw clenched so tightly I thought she might actually break a tooth. "So," I said, struggling to keep the amusement out of my voice, "either my house is haunted, or you made a false complaint." Brenda let out a strangled noise, her face contorted in fury. This is ridiculous. The HOA wouldn't just make something up." I shrugged, feigning innocence. "Guess I should let them know someone's been filing false reports." Her eyes widened in alarm. "Wait," she pleaded, but it was too late. I was already dialing the HOA's number. The call didn't last long. The moment I told the HOA representative on the other end that I had video proof of being out of town, there was a heavy sigh on the other end. "We will look into it," he assured me. That was HOA language for, "We're about to have a very awkward conversation with Brenda." Brenda stood frozen, her mind clearly racing, desperately searching for a way out of this self-made mess. I could almost see her soul leaving her body when I hung up the phone and gave her a polite, albeit smug, smile. "Looks like you might be the one breaking the rules, Brenda. You," she sputtered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You're manipulating the system. You probably faked that footage." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Sure, Brenda. I faked a whole vacation just to trick you." Her face twisted into something truly ugly, a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "This isn't over." I sighed, the weariness returning. "Brenda, maybe just let it go. You're making things worse for yourself." But Brenda wasn't listening. She turned on her heel and stomped back to her house, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. I knew right then that she wasn't giving up. She was just retreating, regrouping, and planning her next move. And if I had learned anything from dealing with Brenda, it was that she wasn't the type to go down quietly. I was right. The very next day, I woke up to find my kids' sidewalk chalk drawings smeared into a muddy, unrecognizable mess. The colorful unicorns and rainbows they had spent hours painstakingly creating were now nothing but ruined streaks on the pavement. My youngest, Lily, stood next to the destruction, clutching sparkly hoof tightly, her eyes welling up with tears. "Daddy," she sniffled, her voice thick with sadness, "who did this?" I already knew the answer. I looked up, and sure enough, there was Brenda, standing on her porch, calmly sipping a cup of coffee as if she hadn't just committed a heinous crime against childhood joy. She caught me looking and smirked, a small, cruel twist of her lips. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my anger in check. This was escalating, spiraling out of control. If she wanted to play dirty, I had no problem getting my hands a little messy too. Brenda thought she could win this petty little war she had started. She had absolutely no idea what was coming next. The destruction of the sidewalk chalk drawings was the last straw. I had tolerated Brenda's ridiculous antics for far too long. And while I wasn't about to stoop to her level of petty vandalism, I also wasn't going to sit back and let her keep getting away with this. She had made it abundantly clear that she wasn't going to stop until she had complete, tyrannical control over the entire neighborhood, and that simply wasn't going to happen on my watch. My kids were understandably upset, their innocent joy replaced with confusion and a touch of fear. But I reassured them that everything would be fine, that I would handle it. Deep down, though, I knew this was far from over. Brenda had declared war, and it was high time for me to start fighting back, not with childish pranks, but with strategic, calculated moves. That afternoon, I decided to have a serious word with some of the other parents in the neighborhood. If Brenda was doing this to me, there was a very good chance she had harassed other families too. And sure enough, the moment I brought up her name, I was met with a chorus of groans, eye rolls, and exasperated sighs. "Oh, Brenda," one mother, Sarah, said with a weary sigh, "she's been a nightmare since the day she moved in last summer. She called the HOA on us because our kids were playing with water balloons in the front yard. Claimed they were damaging the pavement." Another dad, Tom, shook his head in disbelief. "She tried to get my son banned from the community pool because she thought he was splashing too much. It's a pool, for crying out loud. What does she expect?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Brenda wasn't just after my kids. She had been terrorizing the entire neighborhood for years, a silent, simmering menace. The only reason she hadn't been stopped was because nobody wanted to deal with her constant complaining and petty vindictiveness. But now, things were different. Now, we had a common enemy, a shared frustration, and a real chance to finally put an end to her reign of terror. That evening, I started meticulously gathering evidence. I printed out a copy of the false HOA complaint she had filed against me. I saved the security footage proving that my family had been out of town. I even started compiling statements from the other parents, carefully documenting all the times Brenda had harassed them, the ridiculous complaints she had lodged, and the general sense of unease she had cast over the neighborhood. The plan was simple. I was going to present everything to the HOA and demand that they take decisive action against her. No more false complaints, no more petty revenge, no more utter nonsense. If Brenda wanted to play dirty, I was going to fight back with cold, hard facts. But Brenda, being Brenda, wasn't about to make things easy. The very next morning, another official-looking HOA letter arrived in my mailbox. This one was even more ludicrous than the last. According to the complaint, my kids had been recklessly riding their bikes in a dangerous manner, putting the safety of the entire community at risk. The accusation was so utterly absurd that I actually laughed out loud as I read it. My kids were 7 and 10 years old. The most reckless thing they did on their bikes was ride in slow circles on the sidewalk, pretending to be superheroes. I wasn't the only one who found it ridiculous. When I showed the letter to my neighbor, Mark, he snorted with laughter. Reckless bike riding? What does she think this is, a Fast and Furious movie for toddlers? I had absolutely no doubt in my mind that Brenda was behind this latest absurdity. She had lost the initial battle with Officer Miller, and now she was desperately trying to win the war by flooding the HOA with a barrage of nonsensical complaints, hoping something would stick. I wasted no time contacting the HOA again. But this time, I didn't just call. I went straight to their office, determined to confront them face to face. When I arrived, I asked to speak with the person handling my case, a middle-aged man named Greg who looked like he had dealt with his fair share of difficult neighbors. The moment I sat down in his cluttered office, I placed the security footage in the thick stack of complaints I had gathered right in front of him. "Greg," I said plainly, my voice firm and resolute, "Brenda is abusing the system. She's filing false reports, wasting everyone's time, and systematically harassing multiple families in this neighborhood. This has to stop." Greg flipped through the documents, his expression growing increasingly annoyed with each page he turned. "You're not the first person to complain about her," he muttered, running a hand wearily through his thinning hair. "We've had issues." I raised an eyebrow, and he sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "And we've tried to talk to her, believe me. But she always finds some way to manipulate the rules, to twist things around. Technically, she hasn't broken any major bylaws, just a lot of minor ones, a constant stream of petty grievances." I pointed to the false noise complaint she had filed against me. "This," I said, my voice sharp, "this is a blatant lie. She knew we weren't home. That's not just a minor violation. That's harassment." Greg rubbed his temples, his eyes tired. "You're right. And if we can prove she knowingly submitted a false complaint, that is grounds for disciplinary action." I leaned back in my chair, a sliver of hope blossoming in my chest. "So, what's the next step?" Greg exhaled heavily, the sound filled with the weight of bureaucracy. "We'll need to formally investigate her. That means gathering more statements, reviewing any available footage, and confronting her directly with the evidence." "Good," I said, my voice firm with determination. "Because she's not stopping. She destroyed my kids' chalk drawings yesterday." "What's next? Slashing tires?" Greg shook his head slowly, a look of genuine concern on his face. "This woman really thinks she owns the place, doesn't she?" "You have no idea," I replied grimly. By the time I left the HOA office, I felt like we were finally making some real progress. Brenda had spent years bullying people into silent submission, but this time, she had picked the wrong family, and now the entire neighborhood was ready to stand up against her. But Brenda, as always, wasn't finished yet. That night, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed something odd. There was a dark figure lurking near my driveway. At first, I thought it was just a shadow cast by the streetlights, but then I saw movement. Someone was definitely standing near my trash cans, doing something. My heart pounded in my chest as I cautiously stepped closer, my senses on high alert. The figure suddenly turned, and under the dim, flickering glow of the streetlights, I saw exactly who it was. Brenda. And she was holding a can of spray paint. For a split second, we just stared at each other, frozen in the awkward tableau of a villain caught red-handed. Then, like a cartoon character caught in the act, she yelped, dropped the can of spray paint with a loud clatter on the asphalt, and bolted back toward her house, disappearing inside with a slam of the door. I stood there for a moment, utterly stunned, trying to process what I had just witnessed. Slowly, I looked down at the driveway. My mailbox, once a pristine white, had been defaced. Spray-painted in big, bold, sloppy letters, was a message of pure, unadulterated malice: "Noisy brats live here." I let out a slow, weary breath, rubbing my temples in frustration. This woman had officially lost her mind. By the time I turned back toward her house, she had already slammed her door shut, the finality of the sound echoing in the quiet night. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had completely forgotten about my security cameras, which had captured her entire pathetic act of vandalism in crystal clear detail. The next morning, I took the damning footage straight to Greg at the HOA office. This time, there was no hesitation. His face, already etched with lines of stress from dealing with Brenda, turned a shade darker as he watched the video. He called an emergency board meeting immediately. And by the end of the day, Brenda was officially under formal investigation, the evidence against her undeniable. She had spent years making everyone else's lives miserable, casting a dark cloud over the entire neighborhood. Now, it was her turn to face the consequences of her actions, and I had a strong feeling she wasn't going to handle it well at all. The neighborhood had been on edge ever since Brenda's antics had reached this new level of outright insanity. The spray-painted mailbox was the final straw, not just for me, but for everyone who had been quietly suffering under her self-imposed reign of terror. I wasn't the only one who had dealt with her ridiculous complaints, her fabricated reports, and her outright harassment. The difference was that this time, she had been caught in the act, the evidence irrefutable. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the time I walked outside the next morning, a small but determined group of neighbors had already gathered near my driveway, murmuring amongst themselves as they stared at the defaced mailbox, a tangible symbol of Brenda's escalating madness. Some of them had seen the security footage I had sent to the HOA, and it didn't take long before they started sharing their own personal horror stories, their voices filled with years of pent-up frustration. She called the cops on my teenager for simply playing basketball in our own driveway. One man, Mr. Henderson, grumbled, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "She left a nasty, anonymous note in my mailbox just last month because my lawn wasn't perfectly trimmed according to her ridiculous standards," chimed in a usually quiet woman from across the street, Mrs. Davison. "She even reported me to the HOA for having excessive weeds in my yard," another neighbor, Maria, added incredulously, "and I don't even have a garden." A young mother, her eyes still holding a hint of anger, spoke up next. "She made my 6-year-old son cry last week. Told him that sidewalk chalk was vandalism and that she'd make sure he never played outside again." That was the moment I truly understood the depth of Brenda's insidious behavior. Her wrath wasn't just directed at me and my family. It was against anyone who didn't adhere to her ridiculously strict and self-serving rules. But this time, she had gone too far. She had become comfortable in her role as the neighborhood bully, assuming no one would ever dare to push back. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. I spent the better part of the afternoon speaking with Greg from the HOA again, who assured me that Brenda was now being investigated for multiple serious violations, including vandalism and harassment. She wasn't just facing a slap on the wrist or a stern warning this time. If the board ruled against her, she could be hit with significant fines, restricted from making any further complaints, or even, in an almost unbelievable but deeply satisfying turn of events, potentially removed from the HOA entirely. That was the kind of long-awaited justice this neighborhood desperately needed. But Brenda, ever the antagonist, wasn't about to take this lying down. That evening, she made her next desperate move. I was sitting in the living room, finally starting to relax after a long day, when my wife, Emily, glanced out the window and suddenly stiffened. "You have got to be kidding me," she muttered under her breath, her voice laced with disbelief. I got up and followed her gaze. There, in the fading light of the evening, was Brenda. She was outside, standing in her yard, holding a clipboard. Every few minutes, she would march with grim determination up to a neighbor's house, knock on their door with an almost aggressive rap, and engage in what looked like a very tense and one-sided conversation. I couldn't hear the words from inside, but judging by the increasingly exasperated expressions of the people she was speaking to, it wasn't going well for her. Curious, and perhaps a little bit morbidly entertained, I stepped out onto my porch. The moment Brenda spotted me, her face twisted into a bizarre expression that was equal parts smugness and barely suppressed fury. She marched directly toward me, waving her clipboard like it was some kind of weapon. "You're going to regret this," she hissed, her voice low and menacing. I sighed, the weariness returning with a vengeance. "Regret what, Brenda? Regretting that you're finally facing the consequences of your own actions?" She shoved the clipboard aggressively in my direction. "This is a petition. It's to have you removed from the neighborhood." I blinked, staring at the hastily scribbled signatures on the paper in utter disbelief. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," she snapped, her eyes blazing with righteous indignation. "You've been harassing me. You've been spreading lies. You've been turning the whole neighborhood against me." "I don't have to turn anyone against you, Brenda," I said, struggling to suppress a laugh at the sheer audacity of her statement. "You've managed to do that all by yourself." Her eyes narrowed into angry slits. "You think this is funny?" "A little bit, yeah," I admitted, a small, wry smile playing on my lips. Her nostrils flared, and her face flushed a deeper shade of red. "Well, let's see if you're still laughing when you have to explain to your children why they don't have a home anymore." That was it. That was the moment my patience finally snapped, shattering into a million tiny pieces. I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough to make sure she knew I wasn't playing games anymore. "You've called the cops on my kids for playing. You filed false complaints. You vandalized my property. And you really think you're the victim here?" She scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "I was defending my rights as a homeowner." "Brenda," I said, shaking my head slowly, my voice filled with a weary disappointment, "no one wants you here anymore. You've spent years making this place miserable for everyone else, and now that people are finally standing up to you, you're panicking." Her carefully constructed facade flickered, just for a fleeting second, and I saw a hint of fear in her eyes. But then, she straightened her shoulders, her chin jutting out defiantly. "We'll see who wins," she declared, turning on her heel and stomping off toward the next unsuspecting house on her list. But I already knew how this was going to end. No one in their right mind was going to sign her ridiculous petition. If anything, she had just given the entire neighborhood even more reason to want her gone. The next few days were pure chaos. Brenda kept pushing, going door to door, trying desperately to turn people against me and garner support for her ludicrous cause. But it wasn't working. If anything, it backfired spectacularly. The more she ranted about being unfairly targeted, the more people came forward with their own stories about her years of petty tyranny. It became abundantly clear to everyone that Brenda wasn't the victim. She was, and always had been, the problem. Greg from the HOA called me again, his voice sounding almost cheerful for the first time since this whole ordeal began. "We've received over a dozen formal complaints about Brenda just this week," he informed me. "Her case is going to the HOA board for review. And I have a feeling this time, things will be different." I smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile. "And what happens if she loses?" "She'll be fined for harassment, for the false reports, and for the vandalism incident," Greg replied, his voice filled with a sense of grim satisfaction. "She'll also be officially banned from filing any further complaints for the next year. And if this behavior continues, the HOA will escalate to legal action. Her continued membership in this association is contingent on her following the rules, and clearly, her harassment of her neighbors is not being tolerated any longer. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. But Brenda, ever the drama queen, wasn't done yet. She had one last, desperate move to play. The night before the crucial HOA meeting, my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Brenda standing there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face twisted into an expression that was equal parts fury and desperation. "What do you want, Brenda?" I asked, already utterly exhausted by this never-ending saga. Her voice was tight, barely controlled. "Call off your little campaign." I laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "It's not a campaign, Brenda. It's called consequences." She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a menacing whisper. "You think you've won? You think the HOA is actually going to get rid of me? I have connections." I tilted my head, a skeptical look on my face. "Connections?" She smirked, a fleeting, almost pathetic expression of her former self. "I know people on the board. They like me." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I don't think they do, Brenda." Her smirk faltered, the confidence draining from her face. "You don't know everything." "No," I conceded, "but I do know this." I leaned in slightly, my voice firm and unwavering. "Tomorrow, you're going to be sitting in a room full of people who have had enough of you. And for the first time in your life, you won't be able to weasel your way out of it." Her face twisted in pure, unadulterated rage. "You're going to regret this." "That's the second time you've said that," I pointed out, shaking my head in mock concern. "And yet, I'm not the one who's about to face the music." She didn't have a witty retort for that. Instead, she let out an angry huff, spun around dramatically, and stomped back toward her house, the sound of her slamming door echoing through the quiet evening air. I watched her go, then closed my own door, a sense of weary satisfaction settling over me. Tomorrow was the day. Tomorrow, Brenda would finally face the consequences of everything she had done. And somehow, I had a very strong feeling she wasn't going to handle it well at all. The morning of the HOA meeting was electric with anticipation. It wasn't just me who was ready for this. Practically the entire neighborhood was buzzing with a nervous excitement. Brenda had burned so many bridges over the years that people were actually planning to attend the meeting, not out of malice, but simply to witness her finally being held accountable for her actions. The HOA usually held their meetings in a small, rather drab conference room at the community center. But today, due to the overwhelming interest in Brenda's case, they had to move it to a much larger space, the community hall. That's how much damage one person could inflict on a community. I arrived early, but I wasn't the first one there. A few of my neighbors, their faces a mixture of apprehension and anticipation, had already taken their seats, whispering amongst themselves. Greg, the HOA representative who had been diligently handling the case, greeted me with a tired but hopeful nod. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in days, likely due to Brenda's relentless emails and phone calls. "She's already sent 3 emails this morning," he muttered, rolling his eyes. One of them was just the word unfair in all caps. I smirked, a small, satisfied smile playing on my lips. Sounds about right. It wasn't long before Brenda made her grand entrance. She walked in with her head held high, a mask of righteous indignation firmly in place, acting as if she were about to receive some kind of award instead of facing serious disciplinary action. She was wearing her usual power suit, her expression self-righteous, clutching a thick stack of papers that I assumed was filled with whatever nonsensical arguments and fabricated evidence she had managed to conjure up at the last minute. The room quieted as the meeting officially began. Greg cleared his throat, his voice calm and professional as he addressed the gathered group. "We are here today to discuss multiple complaints regarding a homeowner who has been accused of harassment, filing false reports, and violating numerous HOA policies. After a thorough and impartial investigation, we have gathered significant evidence, which we will now review." Before Greg could continue, Brenda immediately shot up from her seat, her voice sharp and demanding. "I would like to speak first." Greg sighed, the weariness evident in his voice. "Brenda, we will certainly allow you an opportunity to respond, but we need to present the findings of the investigation first." Brenda huffed dramatically but reluctantly sat back down, crossing her arms over her chest like a petulant child being told no for the very first time. Greg continued, his voice even and measured as he systematically listed every single complaint that had been formally filed against Brenda over the past few years, from the frivolous police calls to the fabricated HOA violations. Each accusation was meticulously backed by concrete evidence, including copies of her own angry emails, clear security footage of her acts of vandalism, and signed witness statements from her numerous victims. When he got to the part about her spray painting my mailbox, he even pulled up a still image from my security camera, the picture showing Brenda in the act, her face contorted in a mask of pure malice under the harsh glare of the streetlight. The room was utterly silent for a moment, the weight of her actions hanging heavy in the air. Then, someone in the back let out a low, incredulous whistle. Brenda's face had gone pale, a sickly shade of white, but she quickly recovered, forcing a weak, almost pathetic smirk. "This is all a smear campaign," she declared, her voice trembling slightly. "I have been nothing but a responsible and upstanding member of this community. I was simply trying to maintain order and uphold the standards, while others allowed chaos to take over." Greg didn't even flinch at her outburst. "Brenda," he stated calmly, his gaze unwavering, "we have irrefutable evidence that you knowingly filed multiple false complaints. That alone is grounds for significant action." Brenda straightened in her chair, her voice rising in indignation. "I was reporting legitimate disturbances. Isn't that my right as a homeowner?" "Not when the disturbances didn't actually happen, Brenda," Greg replied, his voice firm but still professional. "You accused the Miller family of making excessive noise late at night when they weren't even home. You reported children for the simple act of riding their bicycles on the sidewalk. You called the police over a harmless game of tag. This is not maintaining order. This is blatant harassment." Brenda scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please. Everyone in this neighborhood has been against me from the very beginning. It's clear that I'm the one being targeted, simply because I expect people to follow the rules." A woman sitting near the front, Mrs. Davison, turned around in her chair, her voice filled with years of suppressed annoyance. "Brenda, you tried to get my 7-year-old grandson banned from the community pool because you thought he splashed too much. That's not following the rules. That's just being a miserable person." Another man, Mr. Henderson, raised his hand, his expression one of long suffering. "And let's not forget the time she tried to get the HOA to fine me for having too many flowers in my front yard. Apparently, my petunias were a threat to the community." Brenda turned bright red, her composure finally starting to crumble. "Landscaping regulations exist for a reason," she sputtered weakly. Greg cleared his throat, regaining control of the meeting. "Brenda, at this point, it is abundantly clear that your actions have caused significant distress and disruption to multiple families within this community. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, the board has made a definitive decision regarding your status in the HOA." The room went utterly still, every eye fixed on Greg. He looked down at his notes one last time before delivering the long-awaited verdict. "Effective immediately, Brenda, you will be fined $500 for harassment, $500 for each of the false police reports you filed, and an additional $500 for the vandalism incident involving the Miller family's mailbox. Furthermore, you will be officially banned from filing any further complaints with the HOA for the next year." The moment those words left his mouth, Brenda jumped to her feet, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "What?" Greg continued, his voice calm but firm. "Furthermore, Brenda, if this pattern of disruptive and harassing behavior continues in any way, shape, or form, the HOA will have no choice but to escalate to legal action. Your continued membership in this association is contingent upon your adherence to the community rules and bylaws, and the systematic harassment of your neighbors will absolutely not be tolerated." Brenda looked like she was about to explode, her face contorted in a silent scream of outrage. "This is insane. I am the victim here. You're all conspiring against me." Greg didn't even flinch at her dramatic outburst. "Brenda, if you cannot abide by these clearly stated conditions, you are, of course, free to sell your home and move elsewhere." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. It was the most diplomatic way of saying, "Get out if you don't like it," and everyone in the room knew it. Brenda's mouth opened and closed, her mind clearly scrambling for some kind of counter-argument, some way to twist the situation back in her favor. But for once, she had nothing left to stand on. She had finally, unequivocally lost. After a long, tense silence, she furiously shoved her thick stack of papers back into her oversized handbag, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Then, with a final, venomous glare at the room, she stormed out of the community hall, slamming the door behind her with such force that the walls actually shook. The moment she was gone, a palpable wave of relief washed over the room. The tension that had been hanging heavy in the air for so long finally lifted. People started talking, laughing softly, and exchanging relieved glances. It was finally over. As I stood to leave, one of my neighbors, Tom, clapped me on the back, a wide grin on his face. "You did it, man. You finally got rid of her." I chuckled, shaking my head slightly. "I don't know if she's actually leaving just yet, but at least she won't be able to make our lives miserable anymore." Greg approached me as he was leaving, a weary but satisfied look on his face. "If she violates this ruling in any way, Mr. Miller, please let us know immediately. At this point, we are done giving her second chances." I nodded in agreement. "I appreciate it, Greg." As I walked home under the clear evening sky, I couldn't help but smile. Brenda had spent years trying to control the neighborhood, trying to bend everyone to her will, trying to make everyone as miserable as she clearly was. But in the end, all she had accomplished was to isolate herself completely. She had no more power, no more influence, and no more control over anyone. When I got back to my house, my kids were outside, happily playing in the yard as if nothing had ever happened. The air felt lighter, the sounds of their laughter echoing through the neighborhood without the usual undercurrent of fear. It was peaceful. It was normal. And best of all, it was finally free from Brenda's incessant, ridiculous nonsense. But something deep down told me this wasn't entirely over just yet. Brenda wasn't the type to go down quietly. And if I knew her at all, she was likely already scheming her next move, plotting some kind of elaborate revenge. The crucial difference now was that nobody in the neighborhood was on her side anymore. And without her carefully cultivated power and influence, she was just another bitter, angry person with no one left to listen to her endless complaints. For the first time in what felt like years, the neighborhood finally settled into a genuine sense of peace. There were no more sudden, unwelcome visits from the police. No more absurd, fabricated HOA complaints landing in our mailboxes. And blessedly, no more shrill, angry screaming matches about kids simply playing outside. It was as if the very air had been cleansed, as if Brenda's perpetually negative presence had been a heavy weight pressing down on the entire community. My kids ran around freely, their joyful laughter filling the evening sky without the constant fear of some ridiculous reprimand or fabricated accusation. But as much as I desperately wanted to believe that the ordeal was finally over, I knew Brenda too well. She wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She had spent years meticulously cultivating a sense of control over the neighborhood through intimidation and manipulation, and now that she had been so publicly stripped of that power, I knew she wouldn't simply fade away without a fight. For the next few days, Brenda remained uncharacteristically quiet. Her car was still parked in her driveway, a silent sentinel, but she rarely ventured outside. The blinds on her windows were almost always drawn, casting her house in a perpetual twilight, and there was no sign of her usual morning routine of patrolling the neighborhood for perceived infractions. No yelling at neighbors for their slightly overgrown hedges. No pacing around her yard with a clipboard, meticulously documenting every minor deviation from her self-imposed suburban code. No more piercing glares directed at any child who dared to laugh too loudly. It was eerie, like a cartoon villain retreating into their shadowy lair to lick their wounds and plot their next, undoubtedly more insidious, attack. I knew better than to let my guard down. Brenda wasn't sulking. She was definitely plotting. My suspicions were confirmed one sunny afternoon when my neighbor Lisa knocked on my front door, her face etched with an exasperated expression that mirrored my own. The moment I opened the door, she shook her head slowly, a look of weary resignation in her eyes. "You won't believe what she's doing now," she said, her voice a mixture of amusement and utter frustration. I sighed, already bracing myself for whatever new level of absurdity Brenda had managed to reach. "I can probably guess," I said, a wry smile on my face. Lisa handed me a folded piece of paper. I scanned it quickly, my eyebrows slowly rising in disbelief. It was a letter, one that Brenda had apparently slipped into everyone's mailboxes under the cloak of darkness. "To all my dear neighbors," it began, the saccharine tone immediately setting my teeth on edge. "I regret to inform you that our once beautiful and orderly community has fallen into chaos. The HOA has been corrupted by certain individuals who do not respect the rules, and I have been unfairly silenced for simply trying to uphold the standards that made this neighborhood so great. But I refuse to back down. If you care about preserving our peaceful way of life, please sign the attached petition demanding the immediate removal of the unfair HOA leadership and the reinstatement of our community's original values." I almost laughed out loud. She was seriously trying to stage a coup, to overthrow the very organization that had just sanctioned her. Lisa crossed her arms, her expression a mixture of disbelief and amusement. "She went door to door this morning, trying to convince everyone to sign it. She even told me she's planning to take legal action against the HOA. I shook my head slowly, utterly bewildered by her sheer audacity. "She just doesn't know when to quit, does she?" "Oh, it gets worse," Lisa continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Apparently, she's been telling people that if they don't help her, if they don't sign her ridiculous petition, she's going to report them for various made-up violations once she gets her power back." I exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of my nose in frustration. Brenda had officially lost her last shred of sanity. She had already been banned from filing complaints with the HOA, and now she was trying to stage some kind of bizarre neighborhood revolt. It would have been almost comical if it weren't so pathetic and, frankly, a little bit frightening. It didn't take long for word to spread about Brenda's latest antics. Within hours, a group chat had formed between several families in the neighborhood, all of them buzzing with disbelief and sharing their own experiences with her petitioning efforts. Some people were genuinely worried about what Brenda might try next, but most of them were simply fed up with her endless drama. "She's completely lost it," one neighbor texted. "Who does she think she is, some kind of suburban dictator? What do we even do about this?" Another replied, the frustration evident in their message. "I had an idea. Instead of actively fighting her, instead of giving her the attention and reaction she so desperately craved, we decided to let her dig her own grave. Nobody signed her petition. Nobody engaged with her increasingly bizarre accusations. If she wanted to stand on her porch and rant and rave about a non-existent conspiracy against her, she could do it alone, shouting into the uncaring void of suburban apathy." By the end of the week, Brenda's pathetic plan had completely backfired. Not only did absolutely nobody sign her ridiculous petition, but several more families, emboldened by the HOA's recent actions, submitted their own formal complaints about her ongoing harassment. Greg from the HOA even sent out an official notice to all residents, reminding everyone that Brenda was still under strict sanction, officially banned from filing any further grievances, and that her desperate attempts to overturn the HOA's decision were completely meaningless and would be ignored. Brenda had officially run out of moves. The breaking point, the final act in this long and tiresome drama, came a few days later. I was out in my front yard, finally enjoying a quiet afternoon of yard work, when I saw her. Brenda was in her driveway, struggling to drag a bright yellow for sale sign out of her garage. She wrestled with the unwieldy sign, eventually stabbing it into her perfectly manicured lawn with so much force and fury that I actually thought she might break it. I watched in silence as she stomped back toward her house, her movements stiff and jerky with frustration. She had finally, belatedly, realized she had no more power left to wield in this neighborhood. A few hours later, my phone rang. It was Greg from the HOA. "Thought you'd want to hear this," he said, his voice filled with a sense of finality. "Brenda's selling her house. She officially notified the HOA today." I exhaled slowly, a wave of relief washing over me. I shook my head in disbelief. She really couldn't stand losing, could she? "She brought this entirely on herself," Greg said, his voice firm. "Nobody wants to live in a community where they're constantly being harassed and made to feel unwelcome by their own neighbor." He was absolutely right. Brenda had spent years making herself the most despised person in the neighborhood, and in the end, she had no choice but to pack up her bags and leave. Over the next few weeks, I saw less and less of Brenda. The blinds on her windows remained perpetually shut, and she barely stepped outside her house. When she did, she avoided eye contact with everyone, moving quickly and furtively, as if she were afraid of any kind of confrontation. It was a stark and almost sad contrast to the woman who had once stood on her porch, barking orders at anyone within earshot like she was the self-proclaimed queen of our quiet little cul-de-sac. Then, one crisp autumn morning, the moving trucks arrived. It was a surreal sight, watching her belongings being packed away piece by piece, the tangible evidence of her life here being dismantled and removed. A few neighbors gathered outside, not to gloat or celebrate, but simply to witness the finality of the situation, to confirm with their own eyes that it was actually happening. Brenda, for once, didn't say a word. She kept her head down, her lips pressed into a tight, thin line as she silently supervised the movers, her face a mask of barely concealed resentment. She had spent years making noise, constantly making herself the center of attention, but now, in her final moments in the neighborhood, she was utterly silent. When the last box was loaded onto the truck, she finally turned toward the street. Her gaze flickered in my direction, and for a fleeting moment, I thought she might actually say something, maybe a final, venomous insult, maybe a desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative of her disastrous time in our community. But she didn't. She simply got into her car, slammed the door shut with a resounding thud, and drove away, disappearing down the road and out of our lives. The second her car was out of sight, a slow, spontaneous cheer spread through the small group of onlookers. It wasn't loud or obnoxious, but it was filled with a profound sense of collective relief. Brenda was finally gone. In the days and weeks that followed, life in the neighborhood slowly but surely returned to a sense of normalcy. The kids played outside without the constant fear of the police being called for some ridiculous infraction. Neighbors greeted each other warmly, with genuine smiles, instead of with wary, guarded glances. It was as if we had all been holding our breath for years and had finally been allowed to exhale. One sunny afternoon, I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the peaceful quiet, when Lisa walked by with her young son. She smiled at me, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "I've got to say," she said, shaking her head in happy disbelief, "it feels different without her around." I nodded in complete agreement. "Better," I said simply. "Way better," she echoed with a chuckle, her son skipping happily beside her. Not long after, a new family moved into Brenda's old house. A young couple with two energetic kids who introduced themselves to everyone right away, eager to be a part of our now harmonious community. The first thing their kids did was run outside and start drawing with colorful sidewalk chalk on their driveway. Nobody stopped them. Nobody complained. And this time, I knew with absolute certainty, nobody ever would. Valuable lesson: the story of Brenda serves as a cautionary tale about the destructive nature of unchecked negativity and the importance of community. While it's natural to have preferences and expectations for our neighborhoods, Brenda's behavior crossed the line from reasonable concern to outright harassment. Her constant complaints, false accusations, and petty acts of revenge created a toxic environment that ultimately led to her own isolation and removal. The valuable lesson here is that fostering a positive and tolerant community requires empathy, understanding, and a willingness to compromise. When disagreements arise, communication and respectful dialogue are far more effective than resorting to aggressive and vindictive tactics. Ultimately, Brenda's story reminds us that kindness and consideration for our neighbors are essential for creating a truly peaceful and enjoyable place to live. What are your thoughts on Brenda's behavior? Have you ever experienced a similar situation in your own neighborhood? Share your stories and insights in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more engaging content.